She was beaten every day for being too sick to work. And then a lonely cowboy took her home. But that's not the whole story. Not even close. The wind howled outside the Dust Lantern Saloon, rattling the warped wooden walls like a ghost trying to get in. Inside, it stank of cheap whiskey, stale sweat, and desperation. The piano player hammered out a clunky tune, but nobody was listening. They were listening to the shouting. "Where the hell is she?" a man barked, his voice thick with liquor. He slammed a meaty fist on the table, sloshing beer onto the grimy floor. "I paid for her an hour ago." Miss Geneva the madam glided over, her smile as cracked as the paint on her face. "She'll be right out, sugar. Just freshening up." "She's late again," he snapped. "Always some excuse with that one. Sick, tired, dizzy. You're running a brothel, not a damn infirmary." Behind a stained velvet curtain, Clara stood shaking. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to quiet a cough that felt like broken glass in her lungs. Just minutes ago, she'd coughed blood into a rag. Her fingers were still trembling. Her thin shift was damp with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with warmth. "You go out there, or I'll drag you by the hair," Miss Geneva hissed, her voice all smoke and gravel. The smile was gone. Her eyes were chips of ice. "You think men pay good money to watch you die? You're lucky I even let you stay." "I can't tonight," Clara whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I need—" A slap cracked through the small room like a gunshot. Clara reeled back, grabbing the edge of a vanity to keep from falling. Her vision swam. Geneva sneered, her face a mask of contempt. "Then maybe you ain't worth feeding anymore." The shouting in the main room grew louder. A glass shattered against the wall, and that's when he looked up. Near the hearth, a man had been nursing a bottle of rye, watching everything in silence. His name was Eli McCrae. He'd been in Dead Rock less than a day, but it was long enough to know the whole town stank of rot. His black coat was dusted with snow, his hat shadowing eyes like a frozen creek, still and deep. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was just passing through. Or so he told himself. "Get out there!" Geneva snarled at Clara, giving her a vicious shove. Clara stumbled and collapsed to her knees, a terrible wheezing cough racking her thin frame. The room spun into darkness. The curtain was ripped back. "You lazy little—" And then Eli moved. He was a ghost. No one saw him rise. One moment he was by the fire, the next he was standing between Geneva and the girl on the floor. His voice was low, calm, but it cut through the noise of the saloon like a razor. "You plan to kill her in front of everyone?" Geneva blinked, startled. "Excuse me? This ain't your business, stranger." Eli glanced down at Clara. She was half conscious, a trickle of blood at her temple, her lips split and swelling. He looked back at Geneva, and the cold in his eyes could have frozen the fire in the hearth. "I said," he repeated, slow and deliberate. "Are you planning to kill her?" The entire brothel fell silent. The piano player's hands froze over the keys. The drunk at the bar paused, his glass halfway to his lips. Every eye in the room was on them. Geneva scoffed, trying to regain her authority. "She's my property. I'll do what I want." "She is now," Eli said. Without another word, he reached into his coat, pulled out a thick wad of bills, and tossed it onto the bar. The bartender flinched as it landed. It was more money than the saloon saw in a month. "That cover her?" Eli asked. Geneva stared at the cash, her greed warring with her pride. You're buying her?" "I'm taking her," he said. The words were not a negotiation. They were a statement of fact. She opened her mouth to argue, to call for her hired muscle, but something in his eyes stopped her cold. It was a quiet, certain promise of violence. A promise that he would tear her whole world down around her if she tried to stop him. He bent down and lifted Clara into his arms. She was light as a bundle of sticks. She didn't fight. She couldn't. her head lulled against his shoulder, her faint warm breath soft against his neck. She smelled of cheap soap and fresh blood. The door creaked open, and a gust of freezing wind tore through the room, making the lanterns flicker. Eli stepped out into the blizzard, carrying her as if she weighed nothing at all. The snow swallowed them in seconds. The sound of a single horse's hooves faded into the howling wind. Inside the dust lantern, no one spoke, no one moved, and no one dared to follow. The snow was a blinding white curtain by the time they left Dead Rock behind. The wind howled through the pines like a pack of wolves, tearing at Eli's coat and stinging his face. He pulled the rough wool blanket tighter around Clara. She was limp in his arms, laid gently across his saddle, her head resting against the solid warmth of his chest. She stirred only once, her voice a raw, broken murmur against the storm. "Don't take me back. Please, not back there." "You're not going back," he said, his own voice low and steady, a small anchor in the chaos of the blizzard. He wasn't sure if she could even hear him. His mare, seasoned and sure-footed, trudged up the narrow, twisting trail into the mountains. Eli kept one hand firm on the reins, the other braced around the fragile woman whose life, for some reason he hadn't yet admitted to himself, was now in his hands. She was feather-light, too light. It was the weight of someone who had been starved of food, of kindness, of hope. He knew that weight. He'd carried it before, in another life. He'd carried boys younger than her off of blood-soaked battlefields, their names already forgotten by the men who sent them there to die. He'd followed orders that stained his soul, under a flag he no longer believed in. When the war was finally over, he had wandered west, swearing he'd never again raise a weapon, never again stand by while a life was torn apart. And yet, here he was, riding into a storm with a dying stranger in his arms. The forest grew thicker as they climbed, the world turning silent and sacred under the heavy blanket of snow. Just as the last light of day failed, they reached a small clearing. Nestled in the trees was a small log cabin, a weak curl of smoke rising from its chimney. It was rough, the roof sagging on one side, but it stood strong against the wind. It was home. He dismounted carefully, then lifted Clara from the saddle. Cradling her against his chest, he pushed through the knee-deep snow to the door. Inside, the cabin was dim and cold, the embers in the hearth nearly dead. He laid her gently on the simple cot by the window, then moved with a quick, practiced efficiency. He brought the fire back to roaring life with dry kindling, and the room was filled with flickering golden light. He didn't undress her, just pulled off her wet boots and shawl, and wrapped her in every blanket he owned. He moved to a small kitchen corner and opened a tin box. Inside were bundles of dried herbs, pine needle, sage, yarrow, things his mother had taught him to use for fevers and lung sickness. He brewed a strong, sharp-smelling tea. When it was ready, he knelt by the cot and gently lifted her head. "Drink this," he murmured, holding the warm mug to her chapped lips. Her eyes fluttered open for a second. They were dazed, glazed with fever, but she sipped a little, the warmth seeming to travel through her. Then she drifted back into an exhausted sleep. Eli sat in a chair by the fire, watching her. He watched the color slowly, faintly, return to her cheeks. He watched the tight, pained lines around her eyes ease, just slightly. He listened to the wind battering the walls of his tiny fortress. He wasn't guarding her. He wasn't her owner. He was just there. A silent witness in the night. She didn't know the man he used to be. She didn't know about the ghosts that rode with him, or the promises he had broken. She only knew that when the world had turned its back, a stranger had reached out a hand. And for tonight, in the heart of the storm, that was enough. Clara woke to the crackle of a steady fire and the smell of smoke and pine. The ceiling above her was low and wooden. The walls were solid logs, chinked against the cold. Her body ached with a deep, familiar pain, but it was different. It wasn't the sharp agony of a fresh blow, it was the dull throb of healing. For a terrifying moment, panic seized her. Where was she? Had Geneva sold her to someone worse? Someone who lived in the middle of nowhere? "Easy," a low voice said from across the room. She turned her head sharply. The man from the saloon sat near the fire, his back straight, his hands methodically carving a small piece of wood. His black coat was slung over the back of the chair. He didn't look at her. "You're safe," he said, his voice calm and steady. "You're in my home." She clutched the heavy blanket to her chin, her knuckles white. What do you want from me?" It was the only question she knew how to ask anymore. He finally looked up, his eyes the color of a storm brewing over the mountains. Deep and unreadable. "Nothing," he said simply. "Not your thanks, not your story. Just rest. You can stay until you're strong enough to leave." His tone held no threat, no expectation, and that scared her more than anything. The men she knew always wanted something. They smiled while they took it. This man offered quiet and warmth and asked for nothing in return. It was a language she didn't understand. She lay back down, her body exhausted but her mind racing. She watched him for hours, a silent, brooding shape by the fire. Over the next few days, they existed in a world of silence, walled in by the endless snow. The wind howled, but inside, the fire never went out. Eli was a constant, quiet presence. He split wood, mended a leak in the roof, boiled water. He never hovered, but he was always there. Each morning she would wake to find a bowl of hot soup on the small table beside her cot. Sometimes a thick potato stew, sometimes a thin broth with the herbs he'd brewed. It was always warm. He would refold the blankets she'd kicked off in her fevered sleep. He never asked a single question. He never touched her. On the third day, the fever broke. She sat up, the room swaying only a little. She watched him outside, chopping wood. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows despite the cold, his face tight with concentration. He moved with a quiet precision, not with brute force. It was the efficiency of a man who had learned to survive, to ration every ounce of energy. When he came back inside, stamping the snow from his boots, he gave her a slight nod. "You're upright." "It still hurts to breathe," she said, her voice raspy. He shrugged, adding a log to the fire. Healing always does. Later that day, she finally found the strength to stand. She shuffled across the cabin, her legs unsteady. And that's when she saw it. On the rough-hewn mantel above the hearth, there was a single photograph, its frame intricately carved from pine. The picture showed a woman with a bright, luminous smile, standing beside a much younger version of the man in this cabin. But the woman in the photograph, Clara knew her. Her heart stopped cold. It couldn't be. It was impossible. Her own hand trembled as she reached out and touched the glass. The woman smiling back at her, frozen in time, was her mother. Clara's breath hitched. She turned slowly, her eyes wide with 1,000 questions, and looked at the silent man who had saved her. He was watching her, his face a mask, but his storm cloud eyes held a flicker of something she couldn't name. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Why do you have a picture of my mother?" Eli put down the piece of wood he was carving. The small knife clattered on the table. The silence in the cabin was suddenly heavy, suffocating. He didn't answer right away. He just stared at the photograph, his expression lost in a past she couldn't see. "Her name was Eleanor," he finally said, his voice rough. "She was a long time ago." "She was my mother," Clara said, her voice gaining a desperate edge. "I watched her die of fever when I was 10. How do you know her? Why is she here?" He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the endless white snow. He looked like a man trapped by his own memories. "I knew your father," he said, his back still to her. "We served together, in the war." The words hung in the air. Clara felt a dizzying rush, the floor seeming to tilt beneath her feet. Her father. He had died in the war before she was old enough to remember him clearly. All she had was this one faded photograph of him and her mother. "My father?" she breathed. "He told me. My mother told me he died at Shiloh." "He did," Eli said quietly. "I was there. I was with him." He turned around then, and for the first time she saw the ghosts in his eyes. Raw, unhealed grief. "He made me promise. If anything ever happened to him, he made me swear I'd look out for his family. For Eleanor and his little girl." Clara sank onto the edge of the cot, her mind reeling. This wasn't a random act of kindness in a saloon. This was a debt, a promise made years ago on a bloody battlefield. "I tried to find you," Eli continued, his voice heavy with regret. "After the war, everything was chaos. I looked for years. I heard your mother had passed. I heard a girl matching your description had married a miner named David. I tracked you to Elhorn, but I was too late. The mine had collapsed. They said everyone was gone." He finally met her gaze, his own full of a weary pain that mirrored her own. "I thought you were dead. I came up here to disappear, to be left alone with the ghosts. Then a few days ago I had to ride down to Dead Rock for supplies, and I saw you." He had recognized her. In the gaunt, sick girl in the dust lantern, he had seen the daughter of the man he'd watched die. A wave of emotion washed over Clara, shock, grief, and a strange, bewildering sense of connection. He hadn't just saved a stranger. He had saved her. He had kept a promise for over a decade. But as she looked at him, a new, cold thought crept into her mind. He was telling her the truth. She could feel it. But it didn't feel like the whole truth. There was something he was holding back. Something in his eyes still screamed of a deeper, darker secret connecting him to her family, to her past. This story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Down in Dead Rock, the snow had stopped, but the mood was colder than ever. Miss Geneva wasn't just angry about the money. The wad of bills Eli had thrown on the bar was gone, spent on whiskey and bribes, but her fury remained. It was more than losing property. Clara knowing what she knew. It was a loose end Geneva couldn't afford. She paced her small, gaudy office, the floorboards groaning under her weight. Clara had seen too much. She knew about the accidents that happened to girls who wouldn't cooperate. She knew about the backroom deals with the town's supposed leaders. She knew where the bodies were buried. Literally. Geneva had kept her close, sick and weak, thinking she was no threat. She had been wrong. And now, the girl was with a man who could kill with his eyes. A man with a past. A man who paid a fortune for her. This wasn't a rescue. It was a complication. She slammed her fist on her desk. "Find me Luther Cobb," she snarled to the brute standing guard at her door. The name dropped into the room like a stone. Luther Cobb wasn't just a bounty hunter. He was a predator. A man who tracked people for sport as much as for money. A man who preferred to bring his quarry back cold, claiming they resisted. He was cruel, efficient, and had no conscience to speak of. Within the hour, he was standing in her office, filling the doorway. He was a big man, scarred and weathered, with cold, dead eyes that missed nothing. He listened to Geneva's story without a word, a toothpick dancing in the corner of his mouth. $50 for the girl, Geneva said, her voice tight. Luther grunted. Heard she was sick. Might not survive the trip back in this cold. That, Geneva said, her eyes glinting, would not be a tragedy. The man she's with, he's dangerous. I want him gone too. Permanently. She slid a heavy pouch of coins across the desk. $100. 50 for the girl, dead or alive, and 50 for the man's head. Luther Cobb picked up the pouch, weighing it in his hand. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. His eyes said it all. He looked at the reward poster already tacked to the wall. Runaway girl. Pale, sickly, but valuable. He ripped it down. Don't need this, he grumbled. I know the way into those hills. He rode out before dawn, a phantom against the gray sky. He carried his rifle, a coil of rope, and a chilling patience. He was a wolf on the scent of blood, and he enjoyed the hunt. He followed the faint trail of a single horse, a trail almost erased by the blizzard. He found where they'd stopped to rest. He found a single drop of blood on the snow, melted and refrozen into a dark ruby. Days later, from a high ridge overlooking the valley, he saw it. A thin, almost invisible thread of gray smoke, curling up from the dense pine forest. It was a signal of life. A target. He settled in to watch, his patience absolute. He didn't just want to find them. He wanted to understand them. He watched the man chop wood with military precision. He watched the girl, who looked stronger now, scatter feed for chickens. He watched them sit on the porch, not speaking, but existing in a shared silence. This wasn't what he expected. This wasn't a captor and his prize. This looked quiet. It looked like peace. And Luther Cobb hated peace. He smiled, a grim, ugly slash in his bearded face. He would wait for the perfect moment. He would let them feel safe. He would let them believe they had escaped. And then he would tear their little world apart. Back at the cabin, the quiet was a living thing. Clara felt her strength returning each day, a slow tide rising within her. The color returned to her cheeks, the constant ache in her ribs began to fade. She even laughed once, a small, rusty sound she hadn't heard in years, when a squirrel stole a biscuit right off the porch rail. Eli had looked over at her, and a rare, small smile touched his lips. He taught her the rhythms of his life, how to stack wood to dry, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to set a snare. They worked side by side, their silences comfortable, their movements falling into an easy harmony. The cabin, once just his refuge, started to feel like a home. One afternoon she decided to tell him about her life before, about her husband, David. He worked the mines near Elkhorn, she said, her voice steady as she mended one of Eli's shirts. I told him it wasn't safe. The company cut corners, everyone knew it, but there weren't other choices. She paused, the needle still in her hand. They called it a gas leak, an accident. They said he wouldn't have felt a thing. She looked up at Eli. I never believed that, she continued, the words spilling out now that the dam had broken. We had nothing saved. The company owned our house. They gave me a week to get out. The man I owed for supplies. He was the one who told me about Miss Geneva. Said it was a good way to earn money until I got on my feet. I didn't understand what kind of place it was until the door locked behind me. She rubbed her arms, a chill running through her that had nothing to do with the weather. I wanted to die for a long time. Then I got sick, and I thought, maybe God was finally showing me mercy. Eli, who had been listening silently, got up and poured her a cup of the hot herbal tea she'd grown to like. He set it down beside her, his movements gentle. I don't believe in mercies like that, he said, his voice low. Not the dying kind. From that day on, something shifted between them. The unspoken questions still lingered, but a fragile trust had begun to grow. In the evenings, she would read to him from the few worn books on his shelf. He would sit and whittle, pretending not to listen, but she saw the way his hands would still whenever the story got tense. Sometimes their hands would brush when passing a bowl of stew. A spark, quiet and unexpected, would pass between them. Nothing more. Nothing was ever said. Until the night of the second storm. The wind shrieked down from the peaks, slamming against the cabin like a physical blow. A nightmare clawed its way into Clara's sleep. She was back in the dust lantern, in a small, windowless room, the door locked from the outside. "No," she whimpered, thrashing in the cot, her face damp with sweat. "Please don't. Don't lock me in." Eli was across the room in an instant. He knelt beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Clara," he said, his voice soft but firm, cutting through the dream. "You're safe. You're here. Wake up." Her eyes flew open, wide with terror. She stared at him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't move his hand. He just knelt there, a solid presence in the storm-tossed darkness. The terror slowly receded, replaced by a deep, shuddering exhaustion. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, just for a moment. He stayed there for a long time, his hand on her shoulder, until her breathing evened out, and she drifted back into a true, dreamless sleep. But Eli didn't sleep. He went back to his chair and stared into the fire. He knew that feeling. The locked doors, the darkness. He had his own rooms in his own mind that he could never escape from. The next morning the world was silent again, draped in fresh snow. As Eli went outside to clear a path, he froze. There, near the woodpile, was a single deep boot print in the snow. It was not his. His hand went instinctively to the axe he was carrying. He scanned the tree line. The usual morning chatter of birds was gone. The squirrels were nowhere to be seen. It was the kind of unnatural silence that comes before an ambush. The kind of silence he remembered all too well from the war. The kind that crept in just before the world exploded in blood and gunfire. He backed away slowly, setting the axe down by the door, and went inside. "Don't go outside," he said, his voice tight. Clara looked up from the stew she was stirring, a question in her eyes. He didn't answer. He went to the corner, pulled out a long, cloth-wrapped object from under his cot, and laid it on the table. It was a rifle, well-oiled and cared for, but it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. He moved to shutter the windows, plunging the cabin into a tense gloom, lit only by the fire. "Is it wolves?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Eli checked the load on the rifle, his movements practiced and deadly. "Something worse," he murmured. Outside, hidden among the snow-laden pines, Luther Cobb watched the shutters close. He saw the flicker of movement. He knew they had seen his sign. The hunt was over. The game was about to begin. He chambered around into his own rifle, a cruel smile spreading across his face. The cabin felt like a tomb. The fire was the only light, casting long, dancing shadows that made the small space feel claustrophobic. Eli sat at the table, the rifle across his lap. He worked in silence, his hands moving with a slow, terrible precision. He laid out a row of bullets on a piece of cloth. Then he took out a small, sharp knife. Clara watched, her heart pounding. He was carefully carving small slivers from the lead tip of each bullet, turning them into something jagged and brutal. She had never seen him even touch a weapon before. He hunted with snares. He was a man who chose quiet. But this was the work of a killer. "You've done this before," she whispered. It wasn't a question. He didn't look up from his work. "Too many times." She stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the mutilated bullets. "Did you kill anyone in the war?" The scraping of the knife paused. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then, he set the knife down and leaned back, his face etched with a pain so deep it seemed ancient. "I fought for the South," he said, his voice hollow. "Joined up when I was just a boy, 17. They filled our heads with talk of pride, and land, and honor, lies, all of it." He let out a dry, mirthless breath. "By the time I understood what we were really fighting for, it was too late. My hands were already covered in blood. He finally looked at her, and the ghosts in his eyes were no longer hiding. I killed farmers, boys younger than I was. I killed a man who was just trying to get home to his family. And the worst part, Clara, was that I was good at it. Too good. His voice dropped to a raw whisper. When it was over, I couldn't go home. I wasn't that person anymore. I didn't deserve to be anyone's son. So I rode west. I tried to outrun the man I'd become. Clara crossed her arms over her chest, not to ward him off, but as if holding herself together. Is that why you never carry a gun? He gave a sharp nod. I swore an oath. Never again. Not unless a life depended on it. His eyes met hers, and the unspoken words hung between them. Your life. Tears welled in her own eyes. You're not the only one who lost who they were, she said, her voice cracking. I used to be a wife. I sang when I cooked. I dreamed about planting roses. Then I was just a body in a locked room. I stopped looking in mirrors because I didn't recognize the person staring back. I forgot the sound of my own laugh. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she wiped it away angrily. I didn't know who I was anymore. Not until you brought me here. The silence that followed was thick with shared pain, with the wreckage of 2 broken lives. Eli stood up, the chair scraping against the floorboards. He walked over to her until he was standing just a breath away. The air crackled between them. If I could do it all over again, he said softly, his voice full of a fierce intensity she'd never heard before. If I could ride into that town, knowing everything I know now, knowing there was a man with a rifle waiting in these woods. He paused, his gaze unwavering. I would still pick you. I would still carry you out of that hell. Every single time. Clara's lips parted, but no words came. She didn't need them. In his voice, she heard everything she had ever longed to believe. That she wasn't a burden. That she wasn't a mistake. That she was worth saving. That someone saw all the broken pieces of her and still chose her. In that moment, with death waiting outside in the snow, something real and powerful passed between them. It wasn't a promise of forever. It was a promise of now. A promise to stand together in the darkness. And then, from outside, came the sharp, sudden crack of a twig snapping under a heavy boot. He was here. The night was unnaturally still. The wind had died, and the snow fell in thick, silent flakes, muffling the world. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. Clara lay on the cot, not sleeping, but listening, her entire body rigid with fear. Eli stood by the shuttered window, rifle in hand, as motionless as a statue. They had been waiting for hours. Then, the floorboards of the porch creaked. Luther Cobb didn't bother with stealth anymore. He kicked the door open with a single, violent motion. It slammed against the inside wall, splintering the wood. He stood there, a massive silhouette against the snowy darkness, his own rifle raised. "Evening," he grunted, his dead eyes scanning the dim room. They landed on Clara, and a sick grin spread across his face. "Geneva sends her regards, says you're past due." Then his eyes shifted to Eli. "And you? She wants a word with you too, or what's left of you." "Let her go," Eli said, his voice flat and cold. He didn't raise his rifle. He just held it, ready. "This is between you and me." Luther laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "It's a little late for that, friend. I've been watching you two, playing house. It's almost sweet." He took a step inside, his rifle swinging towards Clara. "See, Geneva doesn't just want her back because she ran. She wants her back because of what her husband, David, found in that mine before the accident." Clara's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" "Your husband wasn't just digging for coal, girlie," Luther sneered. "He stumbled onto a rich vein of silver. Right underland the mining company and Miss Geneva were trying to buy for pennies. David filed a claim. The deed was in his name. Your name, now that he's gone. The gas leak was just Geneva's way of clearing the board, but she could never find the deed. He pointed a grimy finger at her. She thinks you know where it is. It all crashed down on Clara at once. The lies. The cruelty. David hadn't died in an accident. He'd been murdered. And she had been sold to Geneva to be tormented until she broke and gave up a secret she didn't even know she had. You won't take her, Eli said, finally raising his rifle. But something was wrong. His hands were shaking. The weight of the gun, the familiar feel of iron and death, was bringing it all back. The roar of cannons, the screams of dying men, the coppery smell of blood. The boy whose eyes stayed open long after the life had fled them. His breath hitched. The ghosts were here, in the cabin with them, screaming in his ears. Shoot him! Clara cried, seeing his hesitation. Eli, please! Luther saw it too. He saw the tremor in Eli's hands, the haunted look in his eyes. You don't have it in you, do you, soldier? He taunted. I've seen your kind before. You come back from the war with all the killing burned out of you. You're soft now, rusted. He took another step, leveling his rifle directly at Eli's chest. Clara moved without thinking. She scrambled off the cot, grabbing the heavy iron poker from the hearth. No! She screamed. But Luther was too fast. He swung the butt of his rifle, catching her across the side of the head. She crumpled to the floor, the poker clattering from her hand. Seeing her fall, something inside Eli snapped. The screaming of the ghosts was replaced by a single, clarion call. Protect her. He exhaled. The past and the present collided. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The sound was deafening in the small cabin. Luther stumbled back, a look of pure shock on his face. A dark, blooming flower of red spread across his chest. He dropped his rifle, stared down at the wound as if in disbelief, and then collapsed to the floor with a heavy, final thud. Silence. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. Clara pushed herself up, her head ringing, and saw Luther's body lying motionless. Then she looked at Eli. The rifle had dropped from his hands. He was on his knees, shaking violently, his eyes wide and staring at nothing. The cabin was spinning around him. The horrors of the war, held back for so many years, rushed in like a tidal wave. He couldn't breathe. He was drowning in blood. Clara crawled to him, her own pain forgotten. She grabbed his trembling hands. Eli, it's over, she whispered, her voice desperate. He's gone. You saved me. You saved us. He didn't speak. He just stared into the dying embers of the fire, his face a mask of agony. He had broken his oath. He had killed again. The monster he had tried to bury in the mountains was free. But as Luther Cobb lay dying on the floor, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps, he wasn't done. He pushed himself up on one elbow, a bloody, defiant grin on his lips. You think you're her hero, soldier? He rasped, coughing up blood. Eli didn't look at him, still lost in his own private hell. You should have let me die, Clara spat at Luther. Oh, he's good at that, Luther choked out, his eyes fixed on Eli. Letting people die. Ask him about Shiloh, ask him about Captain Miller's unit. At the name, Eli flinched as if he'd been shot again. He slowly, agonizingly, turned his head to look at the dying man. Clara's heart pounded. Captain Miller. That was her father's name. Your daddy wasn't some hero who died charging the enemy, Luther sneered, the life fading from his eyes. He died because of friendly fire. A mistake. An artillery shell called in on the wrong coordinates. And guess who the forward spotter was. Guess which boy gave the wrong numbers that got his own men killed. The blood drained from Clara's face. She looked from the dying bounty hunter to the broken man kneeling beside her. Eli wouldn't meet her eyes. His whole body was trembling, racked with a guilt that was more than a decade old. The man who had saved her. The man who was fulfilling a promise. It wasn't a promise born of friendship. It was penance. A desperate, lifelong attempt to atone for a sin he could never undo. He hadn't just watched her father die. He had caused it. The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place, and it shattered everything. Luther Cobb's last breath was a rattling, mocking laugh that echoed in the sudden, terrible silence of the cabin. The world had shrunk to the space between them. The body on the floor, the smell of gunpowder, the cold seeping through the walls. None of it mattered. There was only the devastating truth hanging in the air, heavier than any snowstorm. "Is it true?" Clara whispered. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. It was the voice of someone who had just lost everything for a second time. Eli finally looked at her. His face was a wreck of grief and self-loathing. He couldn't speak, but he didn't have to. The answer was in his eyes. He gave a single, jerky nod. The foundation of her new life, the fragile hope she had dared to build, crumbled into dust. The man who had carried her from hell was, in his own way, the architect of it. His kindness wasn't a gift. It was a payment on an unpayable debt. She scrambled away from him, pulling herself back until her back hit the cold logs of the cabin wall. She stared at him as if he were a stranger, a monster wearing a familiar face. "All this time," she breathed, the words like ice. "The soup, the blankets, the silence. It wasn't for me. It was for you. To make yourself feel better. To quiet the ghosts." "Clara, no," he finally managed to say, his voice cracking. "It started that way, I won't lie to you, but it changed." "Changed?" she cried, a raw, hysterical laugh bubbling up. "You let me believe you were my savior. You let me feel things for you. All while you were hiding this, you watched me mourn a father you killed." Every word was a nail in his coffin. He didn't defend himself. He didn't offer excuses. He just knelt there on the floor, accepting her judgment, letting her hatred wash over him. He deserved it. He'd known he deserved it every single day for 12 years. She wept then. Not quiet tears, but gut-wrenching sobs of betrayal. She grieved for her father, for her murdered husband, and for the man she thought she was coming to love, who had turned out to be a ghost himself. The night wore on. They didn't speak. Eli dragged Luther's body outside and into the snow. He came back in, cleaned the blood from the floorboards, and rebuilt the fire, his movements mechanical, empty. Clara stayed huddled against the wall, wrapped in a blanket, watching him with hollow eyes. The silence was no longer comfortable. It was an accusation. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world pristine and white, glittering under a cold sun. It felt like a mockery. Clara stood up, her body stiff. Her decision had been made in the long, dark hours of the night. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Eli stopped what he was doing, his back to her. "Where will you go?" "Away from here. Away from you." She began to gather the few things she had, the shawl he'd given her, the worn boots. "I need to find that deed. What Luther said. It's mine. It's all I have left of David. I'm going back to Dead Rock." "You can't," he said, turning around, his face desperate. "Geneva will kill you." "Let her try," Clara said, her eyes flashing with a cold fire he'd never seen before. "I'm done being a victim. I'm done being someone's charity case. And I'm done being your penance." She walked to the door. Her hand was on the latch when his voice stopped her. "Then I'm going with you." She laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "I don't want your protection." "You won't be getting it," he said, his voice raw with a pain that finally seemed to break through his control. "This isn't about protecting you anymore. It's about facing her. It's about justice. For David, for your father, for you. Let me do this one thing right. Not for me." For them. And if, after it's all over, you still want to walk away, I'll let you go. She hesitated. To go back to that town alone was suicide. But to go back with him, it was a torment of a different kind. She looked at him, really looked at him. He wasn't the quiet homesteader or the haunted soldier anymore. He was just a man, stripped bare of all his secrets, offering the only thing he had left. She gave a short, sharp nod. Fine, but when this is over, we're finished. They rode down the mountain in silence, two ghosts returning to the town that had tried to bury them. They arrived in Dead Rock at dusk. The town looked the same, dirty, loud, and soaked in whiskey. But they were different. Eli was no longer hiding from his past, and Clara was no longer afraid of her future. They didn't go to the Dust Lantern. They went to the sheriff's office. The man behind the desk was fat, lazy, and wore a badge that was clearly for show. He was on Geneva's payroll. "We're here to report a murder," Eli said, his voice ringing with an authority the sheriff wasn't used to hearing. "Two of them." The sheriff scoffed. "And who'd be dead?" "David Miller," Clara said, her voice clear and strong. "And Luther Cobb." The sheriff's eyes widened slightly. He knew those names. "Luther's dead? And what's this about Miller? That was a mine accident years ago." "It was murder," Eli said, "and we have proof." He slammed Luther's heavy revolver down on the desk. "He confessed before he died. He was hired by Geneva to kill David Miller and to bring Clara back. He failed on the second part." The sheriff paled. This was getting complicated. He reached for the gun on his hip. He never made it. Eli's hand shot out, faster than a snake, and clamped around the sheriff's wrist. "You have two choices," Eli said, his voice dangerously low. "You can stand with Geneva, and we will burn this whole rotten town to the ground. Or you can do your job for the first time in your life and stand for the law." Fear, real fear, flickered in the sheriff's eyes. He looked at Eli's cold, merciless face, and at Clara's fiery, determined one. He made his choice. They walked into the Dust Lantern saloon, the sheriff and two hastily deputized townsmen behind them. The piano stopped. Every head turned. Geneva was at the bar, laughing with a customer. She saw them and her face went rigid. "Geneva," the sheriff said, his voice trembling slightly, "you're under arrest for the murder of David Miller." Geneva let out a shrill laugh. "You're insane. You have no proof." "We have Luther Cobb's dying confession," Clara said, stepping forward. The entire room was staring at her. She was no longer the sickly, beaten girl. She was a woman forged in fire. "And we have this." She reached into her coat and pulled out a small oilskin pouch. It was something she'd found tucked away in the lining of David's old work jacket, which she'd kept all this time. She'd never known what it was, but now she did. She opened it and unfolded a piece of paper. The deed. "You murdered my husband for a piece of paper," Clara said, her voice ringing through the silent saloon. "And now it's going to hang you." Geneva's face contorted with rage. She lunged, not at Clara, but at the sheriff, trying to grab his gun. But Eli was there. He moved, not with the violence of a soldier, but with the swift, precise grace of a man protecting what mattered. He subdued her, pinning her arms behind her back without throwing a single punch. It was over. The lies, the secrets, the violence. As the sheriff dragged a screaming, cursing Geneva away, the patrons of the Dust Lantern just stared, stunned. Justice had come to Dead Rock. In the sudden quiet, Eli and Clara stood in the middle of the room. The air was thick with unspoken words. "It's done," he said softly. "Yes," she said. She looked at the deed in her hand, then back at him. The anger was gone, replaced by a vast, weary sorrow. "It's done." She turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving him standing there alone. He had kept his promise. He had let her go. The snows melted. The first green shoots of spring pushed their way through the hard soil on the mountain. Eli worked on the cabin, repairing the porch, mending the roof, his hands always busy, his mind always quiet. The cabin was whole, but it felt empty. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was just lonely. He woke from nightmares of Shiloh, but now a new face haunted his dreams. Clara's, her eyes full of betrayal. One afternoon he was splitting firewood when he heard the sound of a horse. He looked up, his heart stopping in his chest. It was her. She was riding a horse she must have bought with the money from the silver claim. She didn't look at him as she dismounted. She walked to the small patch of earth by the cabin door. From her saddlebag, she took out a small bundle. It was a rose bush, its roots wrapped in burlap. She began to dig in the soft earth with her hands. Eli walked over slowly, his heart pounding. He stood there watching her. "I thought you were gone," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "I was," she said, not looking up from her work. "I rode for 3 days. I tried to hate you. I really did. I tried to forget everything you did for me, and only remember the one terrible thing you did to me." She finally stopped digging and looked up at him, her eyes clear and filled with a sad, hard-won wisdom. "But I realized something. The man who made that mistake at Shiloh, he died there too. The man who came back wasn't a soldier. He was just a man trying to find his way back, just like me." She stood up, wiping the dirt from her hands. "Some hearts don't come perfect, Eli. Some come bruised and cracked. Some are full of ghosts." She took a step closer to him. "My life started in the shadow of your mistake, but the life I have now, it started because you chose to save me. Both things are true. I can't have one without the other." She reached out and placed her hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. "It still beats," she whispered. "Even after everything. Mine does too. Maybe they can learn to beat together." Something he had held locked away for years finally broke free. Not guilt, not pain, but hope. A slow, quiet, terrifying hope. He leaned forward and rested his forehead against hers. They stood there for a long time, the world silent around them, the scent of new earth and new beginnings filling the air. Weeks later, when the wild mustard bloomed like a golden carpet across the hills, he took her hand. He placed a simple, unadorned ring in her palm. It was forged from a silver coin, one of the first from her mine. They said their vows alone, with only the wind and the mountains as their witness. "I, who believed I was beyond forgiveness," Eli said, his voice thick with emotion, "choose you. Not because you needed saving, but because you saved me from myself." Clara, tears streaming down her face, whispered back, "And I choose this life, with all its scars, with all its ghosts, with you." They kissed, and for the first time in either of their lives, they felt whole. In a land where guns often spoke louder than hearts, one man laid down his ghosts and picked up love. And one woman, left for dead, found that even the most broken soul can learn to bloom again. This wasn't a story of a simple rescue. It was a story of a complicated, messy, and beautiful redemption. If their journey moved you, if it reminded you that hope can rise from the ashes of the past, then please like, share, and subscribe. Join us for more stories where we uncover the tales of forgotten hearts and the defiant love that outlives dust, distance, and danger. Subscribe now, and we'll see you on the next ride.